Good evening, Council. May I have a mover and seconder to call the meeting to order? Deputy Cabral, Councillor Fisher, that the special meeting of the Council of the Township of Springwater of December 21st, 2022 come to order at 4 p.m. All those in favor? And that has carried. Councillor, are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest this evening? And seeing none, I will call on Director Radigan to introduce Sean Michael Stephen from Watson and Associates.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin and Deputy Mayor Cabral. Through you to members of council. I'd like to introduce Sean Michael Stephen from Watson and Associates. He was acquired through a process where staff wrote a report to council, and we had asked Watson and Associates to create a comprehensive fees and charges study which encompasses the entire organization, including planning as well as building, as well as administration, including clerks, bylaw services, and any other administration services. I will now turn it over to Sean Michael for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon, members of council. So just bear with me. I believe I'm sharing my screen for this presentation. Okay, that should be coming through now. Okay, so as was touched on in introduction, our firm has been retained to undertake a comprehensive review of the township's user fees. And so in making the fee recommendations, which was the principal objective of the undertaking, the key aspects or deliverables that we looked at were first assessing what was the full cost of service for the various user fee service areas. And then based on that full cost of service assessment, making fee recommendations with regard to the governing legislation, ensuring that those recommendations are defensible, having regard for the need and desire for the township to maximize cost recovery through these user fees and thereby decreasing the associated tax burden of funding those services with the various stakeholder interests, and as well as the affordability and competitiveness of those fees, and reflecting industry best practices within those fee structures and policies as well. In terms of the scope of the services and user fees within this review, they can broadly be grouped into two categories of services or fees, those being development related fees. So those included the fees for building permits as well as planning applications. And then within the non-development related user fees that were within the scope, we looked at the administrative services that included clerks, finance, business licenses, special events and signs, municipal bylaw enforcement, including the animal licensing and animal control fees, infrastructure and operational services fees, including both recreation parks and facilities, as well as roads and fleet, water and wastewater services. And so this looked at some of the ancillary miscellaneous activities for which user fees are imposed, and did not address the specific water and wastewater user rates that are established through a separate bylaw and were not part of this review. Fees imposed by fire and cemeteries as well. So the intent for today in my presentation will be to first just give a high overview of the legislative authority to impose the different types of fees, give council an introduction to the methodology that we employed for the fees review and the full cost assessment, then look at what the costing results and fee recommendations are, and then to obtain any feedback before the recommendations are finalized. So firstly, in terms of the legislative context, so the fees for the various service areas are governed by three separate pieces of legislation, those being the Planning Act, the Building Code Act, and the Municipal Act. So firstly, in terms of the Planning Act, the fees for the review and processing of planning applications are governed by Section 69 of that Act. What municipalities are able to do is to impose fees to recover only the anticipated processing costs of each type of application. And so that's important in terms of the process that we went through in detail with staff, in terms of needing to have regard for the anticipated costs of each type of application. So understanding differences between application types of site plan versus zoning bylaw amendments versus committee of adjustment applications, for example, and as well understanding what is the anticipated process and the level of effort and associated costs that would be incurred with each one of those application types. Because the legislation speaks to the anticipated cost of each type of application, that then also sets a restriction that municipalities don't have the ability to cross-subsidize their cost recoveries for planning application review across planning application types. So for an example, municipalities cannot set fees below full cost recovery levels for minor variance applications and make that shortfall up through higher fees for subdivision applications. There is no specific public process in setting of fees under the Planning Act, but the individual fees can be appealed to the Ontario Land Tribunal at any time. So in terms of the Building Code Act, which governs the imposition of fees for the application and issuance of building permits, the Act stipulates that the fees cannot exceed the anticipated reasonable cost of administrating and enforcing the code, and that it speaks to the inclusion of direct, indirect, and capital costs as well. And so in comparison to the Planning Act, the Building Code Act is a little bit more broad in terms of the cost justification that's set, whereby the anticipated cost cannot be, the anticipated fees and revenue cannot be greater than the anticipated administration enforcement of the code, but being set at that code level and not the at the individual application or building permit type level. What's also identified in the Act is that municipalities can create Building Code Act reserve funds, and so with that authority, as well as the ability to recover the anticipated cost of administering and enforcing the code, that speaks to the ability for municipalities to include within their fees contributions to those reserve funds for the future sustainability of that service. Then with building permit fees, there is a statutory public process in terms of having a statutory public meeting of council that must be followed. And lastly, for all fees that are included that aren't under the scope or in the authority of the Planning Act and Building Code Act, they're enforced under the Section 391, Part 12 of the Municipal Act. And within that legislation, it allows municipalities to impose fees and charges for services and activities done or provided on behalf of it. Again, similar to the Building Code Act, that a cost justification level is fairly broad in terms of looking at the overall services that are being provided. And again, there's no public process required here, but the test is that the fees that are being imposed do need to be a fee, and they cannot be a tax. And so they can be challenged to the courts on that ground. So the activity-based costing methodology that we use to establish the full cost of service looked at both the direct and indirect cost of service. So in looking at the direct cost of service, that include both the direct operating costs of the individuals involved in the use of the activities, being not only the salary, wage, and benefit resource costs of those individuals, but as well as the other budgeted costs within their departments. And then also at the capital asset replacement cost associated with the individuals directly participating in those service activities, or for the assets that are being provided by the township to provide service. And then the indirect costs that have been included are for areas like general governance, finance, HR, for example, being those costs of the organization that are required for those direct service functions to provide those activities. So looking at that briefly, illustratively in terms of that methodology, what we went through in detail with staff was first establishing what were the individual categories of fees that we would be assessing the full cost for across the various service areas. So for example, within building permits, looking at the various types of building permits, whether it be residential, non-residential, new construction versus alterations, for example, various types of planning applications, and across all of the other services as well, as illustrated on the right-hand side of this illustration. Then we spent a considerable amount of time with staff looking at who would be involved in these processes and how much time would they spend, as well as looking at what the individual process would be in terms of going through the review of planning applications and building permits, understanding how much time staff would spend on those individual processes, and then making sure that we were testing the reasonableness of those estimates on an annual basis when we consider what are the volumes of those applications or user fees that staff would be involved in, and what would that mean in terms of the annual utilization of staff, and is that reasonable, reflective of their available time annually, given that they may be involved not only on these user fee activities, but may have other responsibilities within the organization. And the left-hand side of the illustration identifies that in addition to the allocation of the direct staff involvement, we also accounted for the overhead and support functions based on the utilization of those staff positions. Then just to highlight for you one tweak in terms of what I've called here facility and program related fees. So most notably parks and recreation fees, is that here we're looking less so at the individual process that staff would proceed through that fees are imposed to recover the cost for, but more so at what is the overall cost of the program that's being delivered and the cost of the facilities that are in service to provide those activities. And so again, looking at those same types of cost components in terms of indirect overhead and support functions, as well as the direct costs, including those programming costs for the individual programs, and then the operating and maintenance and capital replacement costs for the individual facilities, to be able to account for what are those total annual costs of programming, total annual costs of providing those facilities, and making sure that those facility costs are also accounted for when we look at the costs of providing programs through those facilities. So in terms of the draft, the findings, so firstly, in terms of the utilization of staff on the user fees within these various service areas that were assessed, across the organization, it counts for just over 20 full-time equivalent staff positions being utilized on these activities. And we can see here how those break down by department, with a little over half of that level of effort being from staff within building services, with the majority of that time being spent on building permit review. Other notable areas include planning staff contributing about 13% of that overall level of involvement, infrastructure and operational services about 8%, and parks and recreation staff about 14% on those parks and recreation activities. When we look at as I mentioned, with building services spending the majority of their time on building permit review, some of these departments would be involved not just in the user fees within their individual department, but would also be involved in other user fee activities where there is cross-functional involvement across the organization, most notably with planning applications, which, while the main individuals involved in the review of planning applications are staff within the planning department, there is involvement from other individuals in areas like infrastructure and building and fire who are circulated on those applications. So based on that level of utilization, the annual cost and an assessment of current of annual revenue based on current fees is shown in this table. And so across all of the service areas, the annual cost to the township are $7 million annually. That breaks down about 2.1 million for the development-related planning and building fees, and about 4.9 million for the non-development-related fees. When we look at the revenues across those same service areas, within the development-related areas, about $2.1 million in revenue is anticipated, about 102% cost recovery overall. We can see that that varies quite significantly between planning, where those fees are recovering about 62% of those costs, and building, which are recovering about 113%. And so with regard to that level of cost recovery for building, we'll speak to that in a little bit more detail as it pertains to future fees, as we identify that those fees are in place not just to recover the annual cost of service, but also to make sure that they are providing for contributions to the reserve fund for the sustainability of that service. And then looking at the Municipal Act fees, it's quite a variation in level of cost recovery by service area. And that's to be expected to some extent, as some of these services like Parks and Recreation are provided with much more of a greater community benefit, and would typically be designed to have a greater level of tax support, while others might have a greater individual benefit and fees being set closer to full cost recovery levels. So the fee recommendations for the non-development fees are provided in.
Sorry, excuse me, Sean. Sean Michael, I just have a question, if you don't mind, if we can ask as we go along.
Sure.
And I believe it's on the previous slide, and it's from Deputy Cabral.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. And that was part of my question, was whether we would be able to ask questions now or save them till later. When we're talking about the annual costs here, we're talking about the costs as they relate specifically to staffing engaged in providing a specific service or providing for permit processing, that kind of thing. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Specifically to those processes that related to the that the fees are imposed for, not the cost of these departments overall.
Follow on.
Thank you. Just with respect to the animal licensing and control, I mean, there's a fair difference there. What are you going to be providing us any suggestions to the ones that we don't really control? We control the aspect of registering animals for those folks who actually want to license them, but we don't have a whole lot of control about the call outs and the facilities where we have to take abandoned animals, or if we have to have an animal destroyed. We don't control those costs or the frequency of those costs. Is there something going to come from your report with respect to how we might be able to mitigate some of those costs?
Sean Michael?
No. So the scope of the review is not to look at a service delivery review and assess how you are providing these services and whether there are any efficiencies, but only to look at what is the cost of the services that you are providing and how those can be recovered through fees.
Oh, I think Sean Michael, are you still there? You appear to be frozen. Oh, you're there. Councillor Thompson does have a question as well, please.
Could I get an example of a fire service?
Sure. So emergency responses to fire alarms and elevator issues, for example, as well as burning permits.
Thank you. If you could continue, Sean Michael.
Okay. So the non-development fees, the specific fee recommendations are identified in the executive summary in chapter 4 of the report. The fees have generally been set to improve cost recovery levels, or having regard for the specific fees imposed in neighboring municipalities, as well as some of the discussions we've had with township staff. And so the fees were compared to some of your neighboring municipalities, including Barrie, Clearview, Tay, Essa, Tiny, and Oro-Medonte. And so when you see those fee recommendations, they have been provided in 2023 values compared to the 2023 cost based on the 2022 budget and 3% annual cost inflation assumptions. One item to note here with respect to those fee recommendations is that the suggested or fees for parks and recreation are not put forth as a recommendation of the fees that the township should be imposing in 2023, but the maximum fees that could be imposed relative to the market comparators, but that the township would implement any increases towards those suggested fees on a phased manner so that they can monitor any impacts on service utilization and other objectives around the delivery of parks and recreation services. So based on the recommendations that are contained, the revenue across all the categories would increase by about $295,000, increasing overall revenue for these non-development fees by about 36%, from 17% cost recovery to about 22% cost recovery. Of that increase in annual revenue of, again, just $295,800, about 3/4 of that would be related to the fee recommendations for roads and fleet, as well as administrative user fees. And so the roads and fleet user fees would generate about $126,000 in additional revenue and about $91,000 in additional revenue for the administrative fees. So then moving forward to the planning application fees, the annual cost of processing planning applications we calculated with $454,000. Currently, the existing planning application fees recover about 62% of those costs, represent a shortfall of about $172,000. That level of cost recovery, as we saw elsewhere, does vary by planning application type. And so we can see some application types performing quite well, like site plan applications recovering the full cost of service, subdivision, official plan and zoning bylaw amendments, not performing too badly, between 73 and 79% of costs. But then committee of adjustment applications recovering only 55% of those costs. And that's fairly common across municipalities in Ontario, as fees for committee of adjustment, like minor variance applications, are typically set below full cost recovery levels, as these are applications that are most often applied for by existing residents and constituents, and not necessarily professional developers.
Sean Michael, Deputy Mayor Cabral does have another question.
Thank you. I don't actually know if Mr. Sean Michael can answer this particular question. It's in respect of the site plan costing and fees and current fees. I don't know if Director Spagnol is available, but is it not normal in a site plan agreement that most fees are part of the agreement, where the person who's made the application would be paying for those additional fees? That would kind of explain why it's almost 100 or 103%.
Director Spagnol?
Thank you, Mayor Colgan, through to Deputy Mayor Cabral. I guess the key distinction between site plan and the rest of the applications is typically there's not a site plan process, so that doesn't, or sorry, a public meeting process, so that doesn't get factored into the level of effort that goes into those fees. And in addition to that, Ainley Group is also a third-party peer review of engineering submissions for those applications, and those reviews are 100% covered by the developer. So the fees for site plan are really intended to pick up any effort from planning staff and the internal circulations to senior staff. Anything outside of that would be covered by the developer entirely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sean Michael, if you can continue.
Thank you. So the annual, and just as well to highlight in terms of the recommendations that have been put forth here, and sort of the context of the changes in the legislative environment that we're currently in. So the annual cost of proposed fees have been assessed based on the current development review process in the township. So any further impacts or changes to that review process as a result of either township-led changes around site plan and zoning bylaw amendment application review processes, in terms of changes that might occur to try and mitigate any refund requirements as a result of Bill 109, as well as any changes that might be forthcoming around county and lower tier approval authority as a result of Bill 23, are continuing to be assessed by the township and would be considered before making any further changes to those planning application or the development fees. What I also wanted to highlight was that within the annual cost of planning application review, that accounts for only about 44% of available staff resources in the planning department, recognizing that staff are spending a significant amount of time on other activities not related to the processing of planning applications. And that level of utilization is fairly consistent with what we see in other municipalities or other similar sized municipalities and planning departments. And so when looking at the individual fee recommendations that are contained in the report, those again have been made to either move to full cost recovery levels or with increases to only market levels for specific fees. And so that being done for committee of adjustment applications and with other application fees moving to full cost recovery levels. So then in terms of the overall cost performance with the current and proposed fees, we can see that the planning application fee recommendations would increase planning application revenue by about 54%, an increase of just under $154,000 across the various planning application types. With that, again, as you can see here, that shortfall being noted for committee of adjustment applications, as well as for some of the other miscellaneous application types. And moving forward to building permit fees, as noted in the introduction, the current fees for building permits are recovering greater than the full cost of service, about $1.8 million in revenue compared to annual cost of $1.6 million. When we look at that by type of building permits, whether that's new residential construction, residential alterations and other minor permits, new non-residential permits, or other sort of miscellaneous permit activity, what we can see is that the fees for new residential permits are recovering more than their costs, while the other the fees and revenues for the other permit types are recovering less than full cost levels. And that's, again, fairly typical to see, especially as it pertains to new construction versus minor alteration and residential and minor permits and alteration permits, because the part of the objective of setting these fees is also to encourage compliance with the building code, and setting fees for minor alteration in residential permits and full cost recovery levels would go counter to that and likely push a lot of that activity underground and increase enforcement costs to the municipality. And so although the current fees, again, are recovering more than the full cost of service, I want to reiterate that in looking at the fee recommendations, we're looking at that in the context of the anticipated costs and revenues over a 5-year forecast period to make sure that the fees are sufficient to provide for a sustainable provision of service. And so the approach we've used in in setting those fees is to establish a target reserve fund multiple that should be achieved to provide for that sustainable level of service. And the approach that we've utilized, which is consistent with the strategy utilized by most municipalities throughout the province, is to have a target reserve fund balance based on a multiple of annual cost of service. And the rationale here is that the municipality has to meet certain legislative turnaround times around building permit review. They have to have qualified building code officials, and with that tightened labor market, municipalities don't have the ability to change their staff complement as changes in application volumes occur. So in an economic downturn where building permit activity might be lower than anticipated, municipalities need to have a reserve fund in place so that they can maintain that level of service provision, so that when those levels of development do return, they are able to process those building permits accordingly. And so the proposed strategy is to establish a target multiple of 2 times the annual direct cost of service. And so to achieve that target multiple by 2027, what's proposed is a 5% fee increase in 2023, so just above inflationary levels, followed by 3% increases thereafter. And so as illustrated in this graph, we can see that the current reserve fund balance of just around $2 million represent under 1.5 times the annual direct cost of service. And with the proposed fee increases, we can see that by 2027, the reserve fund would achieve that target multiple. And then at that time, the municipality, it would be suggested the municipality monitor those annual levels of cost and revenue and adjust fees accordingly, so that there is not further unnecessary reserve fund accumulation beyond those levels that are required for the sustainable delivery of the service. So what I wanted to do lastly was around the development fees that are being proposed, is to put those in the context of the overall municipal cost of development. And so what we find is helpful is to look at those fee increases around the planning applications and building permits, not just in the context of those individual fees, but in the context of the total cost of municipal development, including development charges. And as well, looking at that for a variety of development types across both residential, non-residential, and sizes and density of development. And so we've looked at 4 different sample development types, being a larger low density development will go through official plan, zoning bylaw amendment, and subdivision approvals processes. A smaller residential development going through 25 unit medium density development, going through zoning, condo, and site plan applications. A smaller retail development going through zoning and site plan, and then a larger industrial site plan, a development of 10,000 square meters. So in the following slides, there are bar graphs illustrating the overall fees that would be payable under the current and recommended fees. What I did want to highlight for you here, though, is sort of a summary of those impacts by development type, where looking at on the top table, the impact when considering just the planning application fees. You can see that the fees would increase by more than 100% for each sample development type. About 103% for the low density residential development, as high as about 234% increase for the smaller site plan development. And we can see that relative to their ranking in comparison to the other municipalities, that would increase the position of the township to the highest in a couple of circumstances, or to second for the small retail development, and fourth for the smaller residential development. But on the bottom table, I think this puts it into the proper context of to achieve these full cost recovery levels and not have the tax base subsidizing development review. What does that impact on the overall cost of development? And so we can see, including development charges and building permit fees, the ranking of the township relative to the other municipalities remains unchanged, either at second or third in the overall ranking. And the increase in those overall fees is nominal for the larger development types, less than 1%, slightly greater for the smaller development types because of the lower impact of development charges. And so I think that that impact, I think is a little bit more meaningful looking at this graphically, where we can see the position
Sorry, Sean, if you could just go back to the previous slide. And earlier in the presentation, you said, or what I heard was that under the Planning Act, specific planning applications cannot be utilized or increased in order to offset the costs in other areas.
Mhm.
But when I look at our industrial development application increases, is that increase, are we already that far ahead and that's just with the 5% increase, or are we increasing that 234% increase? To me, that suggests that we're increasing one type of permit to offset an increase in another.
Yeah, so I guess maybe just firstly to note that I think there's a titling error here. The bottom line should say the retail development, just in case that was throwing you off. And so when setting fees for planning applications, so that test is at the planning application type that level, so at site plan overall. Recognizing then within the specific design of the fees, there may be differences between that level of cost recovery for a minor application type versus a major application type. And then as well, where there are variable components to fees, such as per unit fees or fees charged per square meter or per the gross floor area of the development, those will also result in differing levels of impacts depending on the sample development that you're looking at. So that's part of the reason why I find it helpful to look at sample development, is because sometimes looking at just the fee on its as an individual fee isn't that helpful from a comparison standpoint. If there's a change in structure, and as well when you look at other municipalities and they have fees that might be structured quite differently, it's hard to compare those on a like-for-like basis.
Thank you, Sean Michael. And through to Director Spagnol. Earlier, the question was asked about site plan revisions. And when you spoke earlier, it was suggested that they're pretty straightforward and we're able to collect our fees or recover our costs. So why is it that we're charging almost 200% on industrial and retail site plans versus 100% on residential?
Mayor Coughlin, I guess the way to describe this is that the site plan application fees were originally adjusted to major application fees and minor application fees. And there was no criteria other than a total square footage to determine what was major and what was minor. And so historically what's happened is there has never been an application fee assigned to the major applications because we just simply didn't have development or buildings being constructed that would fall under that category. The adjustment to the site plan fees is really based on the scale of development from a square footage standpoint, and the fee really adjusts based on the size of the development versus just a category of either major versus minor. So although it does look like there's an increase, the fees are adjusted to match the level of effort that would go into the specific size of that particular development, as opposed to standardizing it under a major application at, I believe it was 10,000 square meters, which a municipality has never developed a building to that size to this point. So really the fees are adjusted to match the scale and be adjusted based on the scale and scope of the development that's being considered.
Thank you for the clarification. Sean Michael, if you could continue.
Absolutely. And so just looking at these impacts, I think graphically quickly to finish up, we can see that the position of the township remains unchanged relative to those comparators. And so with these fee increases not changing that relative competitiveness of the municipality just purely from a municipal development fee perspective. So for the larger low density development, still maintaining that position second in the ranking. Similarly with the smaller 25 unit medium density development, again, remaining below Barry and above that of Clearview and Tay. Then for the non-residential types, maintaining that position third in the ranking.
Apologies
case.
again, Sean Michael. At the bottom on your points 1 through 4, indicating that this is not municipal wide, this is specific to one DC area. So we're not being compared. Sorry, my question is, are we being compared to Clearview as a whole, or is it simply Elmville compared to Stayner compared to Angus? Are we using specific areas or the municipalities as a whole?
Yeah, so we're using for the purpose of the comparison and the fact that these municipalities have different development area specific development charges in different communities. So we've chosen one in the either the mid range or the area where they're receiving the greatest amount of growth for comparison purposes with respect to the development charge.
Sorry, please continue.
So with the non-residential types, we can see here with a fairly nominal increase to the overall cost of a development for a larger industrial development, maintaining that position. And then with the smaller non-residential retail development, a slightly greater increase from a percentage standpoint of about 6%, but still maintaining that same position above that of Tay, below that of Clearview and Barry. And so in terms of next steps in the process.
Deputy Cabral has a question on the previous slide, please.
Thank you, Sean Michael. My question, I guess, is in relationship to the slides themselves. I noticed on the previous one, all of them started off green and then was the blue line to show the top. However, I noticed yellow and blue. Are those significant to us, or are these slides utilized somewhere else and they represent something there?
So the colors, sorry, maybe difficult to see in the legend at the bottom. So I probably should have highlighted this for you, my oversight. The dark blue section represents the development charges, and so that's the largest share of the cost of development. The green section is the portion that is the building permit fees, and then the other colors are dependent on the type of planning application fee. So in this case, the lighter blue is a zoning bylaw amendment fee, and the yellow is a site plan.
Thank you, Sean Michael. And the reason for the question was actually a technical one. Unfortunately, Deputy Cabral's Zoom was at the bottom of it, so it actually covered up the legend there. So thank you.
So, so in terms of next steps in the process, we'd like to receive any feedback from council on the proposed fee recommendations in the report. And then the last step would be with respect to the building permit fee recommendations, that those would be brought forth to a public meeting of council, which is currently scheduled for the 18th of January next year. So it does conclude my presentation. I'm of course available if there are any further questions or comments I can assist with.
Thank you, Sean Michael. And I'll open it up to council if there's any further questions for Sean Michael or any members of staff. My question would be, with the fee breakdown that will be coming at a subsequent meeting, will council have an opportunity to see with how the increase actually impacts? Meaning if it was $1,000 fee today for something, is it simply just adding another $50 onto it, or how is this? Is it across the board 5% that we're looking at, or are there specific applications that will receive? Are we going to get a breakdown of the individual costs or increases? Director Radigan? You're muted, Director Radigan.
I apologize. Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and through you to members of council. I do believe a breakdown of each fee recommendation by department was provided in chapter 4 of the written report. So if you, I believe there, it starts on chapter 4, which is page. It starts with the Municipal Act user fees. And then does break them down by clerk's department, finance department, and it does provide an overall idea of what the current fee is versus what the recommended fee is as well. I hope that helps clarify.
Thank you. And Sean Michael?
Thank you. So I was just going to highlight for you that for ease of reference, the individual fee recommendations are also in the executive summary of the report.
Deputy Cabral?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. I guess it's a question for Mr. Sean Michael, or could very well be for CAO Schmidt. But in the report itself, there were a number of user fees that were non-existent before, and are now being shown as being, I guess, new user fees for those specific services. And I'm just curious to know whether or not those particular user fees, and I apologize, I won't be able to direct you to any particular one in that report. I didn't make a notation of the page number. I did notice them though. Are they in line with what other municipalities that you used as comparators, that these user fees are already shown there? I mean, we used to give fire permits away for recreational purposes with no cost, which kind of let us know where folks were going to have fires in their backyard. And then that was implemented as a $15 fee. And I did note that went up, but there were a few others that we weren't charging for that now there's a suggested or proposed user fee being implemented.
Director Radigan?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and through you to Deputy Mayor Cabral. I could definitely start the conversation and then Sean Michael can add. I do believe the scope of the project was that this review would include surrounding municipalities, comparable municipalities, to ensure the fee was comparable and that we were meeting best practices within the municipalities that are surrounding us. I can confirm that the majority of the fees within the report are existing fees. The main ones that I can note that are new fees are actually under the finance department. They have not existed throughout finance. However, we are recommending that we do start charging for them. An example of these would be tax ownership change, new tax accounts set up per property, overdue tax notices, administration fees on subdivider accounts, WAMCO appointment fee as well. So these are all fees that Watson and Associates would have looked at that other municipalities are charging, but the Township of Springwater is not currently charging for them. So it is an area that I would say currently is being subsidized by the taxpayer, and we would be looking to recoup these fees from direct users. Thank you.
Follow on, Deputy Cabral?
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. As a matter of fact, that was a couple of the ones that I actually did note. The other one was when there was a disconnect, I guess, through non-compliance. It seemed a little bit high for me, but I can understand that might be to convince folks that maybe they want to comply with the rules. I guess some of those fees, although I do see them and they're not particularly exorbitant. However, it's not as if these folks have a choice in whether or not they pay taxes. So it's an obligatory account. So I would like maybe to see some further discussion on those particular fees coming down the road, because they are going to be taxpayers and that's why they have to open that account. So I guess if folks don't complain about it, it's a moot point, but those did kind of catch my eye. Thank you.
Counselor, are there any further questions? All right. Okay, well, thank you, Sean Michael. May I have a mover and seconder
You're
to
welcome.
receive the presentation? Counselor Thompson, Deputy Cabral, that the report from Watson and Associates titled the 2022 Comprehensive User Fees and Charges Reviewed Study dated December 21st, 2022 be received, and that council directs staff to incorporate the recommendations provided within.
I'm sorry, Mayor Coughlin. When we're receiving it, I'm happy to receive it. I do have some difficulty in adopting the recommendations at this point. It's a 107-page document that we just received the other day. I don't know about the rest of the members of council who may have full-time jobs, but I, to be quite frank, would like to have additional time to review that document. I think it might be more appropriate if it comes back to us at the same time that staff will be presenting their facility review fees. I just think it's premature to adopt it and put it into play right now without really having a fulsome discussion and a fulsome review of the document so that we can decide whether or not we want those. As a matter of fact, I'll just go back to what Mr. Sean Michael said.
Councillor Cabral, I'm just gonna, and my apologies for interrupting. The second part of this says, and that council directs staff to incorporate the recommendations provided within the report for consideration within the 2023 operating budget.
Well, I'd still like to have a bit of a discussion on it. So
Okay.
is that when it would happen? Maybe CEO Schmidt could clarify that. I'm just a little bit leery of pushing it forward. I think we've all been in situations in the past where we have pushed something forward to be considered at a later date, and then it's come back to bite us, and we've been suggested to us that it needs to be reconsidered or whatever. I just want to make sure we're going to have an opportunity to discuss it in depth. I'd also like to know, and not to put anybody in the hot seat, but having the report come to staff, to council members just prior to the meeting, really yesterday, doesn't really give us an opportunity to review it and digest it properly so that we're in a position to actually ask the WSP representative, Sean Michael, the appropriate questions that we might like to ask regarding the report and the presentation. So I don't know if there's any comment on that, but
Director Radigan has come on screen here.
thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Cogman, and through you to Deputy Mayor Cabral. I do apologize if the report was submitted late. The idea was to try and get it in front of council, but not to have council adopt any of the fees at this moment. We will be bringing it forward as part of budget considerations, and it'll come through as a program change. It will not be part of the base budget. So it will allow council that opportunity to review each of the fees as part of a program change. And we would not be taking into consideration 100% of these fees. I think the idea would be to be conservative because a lot of them are based on volume. And so we can't predict volume. So the idea would be to take a conservative approach, but that will all be coming forward as part of a program change for council's consideration. So we are requesting that we defer this until the budget discussions to allow for council members to have time to further review and review as part of the budget. Thank you.
Follow on.
Follow on.
Thank you, but and I do appreciate the response. Maybe there were some tight timelines, but I still think it puts members of council, certainly myself, in a bit of a predicament where there may have been other questions that I would like to ask Mr. Sean Michael. However, to be quite honest with you, I did not have the opportunity to really go through that report in the manner with which it should have been read and the attention that it should have been given. It's 107 pages or 110 pages. That's a lot of stuff to digest and to go and review all of the different fees and the fee structure and try and, make notations and do all that. It's pretty tough to do. And we're going to lose the opportunity unless Mr. Sean Michael is invited back to come before council again at a later date when we review it. we're not going to have the opportunities to ask the people who authored this particular report. So that's just a comment I want to make with respect to that. The other question I do have would be, I guess, for Director Radigan, with respect to 2023, do we know what a 1% increase in taxes is going to translate into as far as dollars are concerned?
Director Radigan?
Through you, Mayor Coughlin, to Deputy Mayor Cabral, we do have a good idea. In prior years, we were looking at about 165,000. So you definitely would be looking at around that figure, a little bit more.
Thank you.
Okay, council, we do have this duly moved and seconded, and Councillor Cabral, are we satisfied with the redirection to the next meeting?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. So I'll read it again as a whole, that that the report from Watson and Associates titled 2022 Comprehensive User Fees and Charges Review Study dated December 21st, 2022 be received, and that council directs staff to incorporate the recommendations provided within the report for consideration within the 2023 operating budget. All of those in favor? And that has carried. May I have a mover and seconder for the confirmation bylaw? Councillor Garwood and Councillor Cabral, that the bylaw 2022 -102 to confirm and adopt the proceedings of the council of the special meeting held on December 21st of 2022 listed herein be signed and sealed by the mayor and clerk. All those in favor? That has carried. And may I have a mover and seconder for adjournment? Councillors Fisher and Thompson, that the special meeting of the Township of Springwater does here now adjourn at 4:56 p.m. to meet again in regular meeting on December 21st at 6:30 p.m. All those in favor? That is carried. Thank you.